let me start by saying it's a great honour to address this group, but I think also a really important and useful opportunity, and very much for the reasons that the Minister has just set out. You said, Minister, that this group was taken by surprise by the vote in June. I think it's probably fair to say you were not alone. This was a shock to many people. I think what I would say to begin with is Britain has voted to leave the European Union, and we have a government which is committed to achieving that. There is, of course, debate you'll see in our politics from time to time about whether at some point in the future we might reconsider. But I think what I need to make very clear this afternoon is that we have a government which is committed to implementing the will of the people as expressed in that vote in June. And in fact, if you look at our political landscape at the moment, most of the major political parties have said that they respect that vote and that they will work towards delivering Britain leaving the European Union. Which, of course, doesn't mean there isn't a lot of politics and a lot of argument to come about exactly how we leave the European Union, and perhaps most importantly, what kind of relationship we have with the European Union once we have done so. But I think the first thing you should all take away, and I'm sure that British ambassadors and high commissioners in your countries are telling you the same thing, Brexit is going to happen. That's what the British people voted for. It will take time. It will be complex, and there are a huge list of issues that we have to work through as a country, and we have to work through both with our European colleagues, but also with our partners around the world, and it's great to be amongst such an important group of those partners today. We have said, the Prime Minister has said, that we will invoke the so-called Article 50 by the end of March 2017. And those of you who have a quiet moment and want to read the European Treaty will find out, reading Article 50, that envisages a 2-year process. And therefore, logically, one would expect the United Kingdom to leave the European Union sometime in the spring or summer of 2019. I say logically. This is the European Union, and things can happen. But that's the assumption, I think, on which most people are now working. During that time, so over the next 2 and a bit years, we remain bound by all of the obligations of being a member of the European Union, and we also have all of the rights of a member of the European Union. So one issue I hope I can be absolutely 100% clear on today is that all of the trade obligations that Britain has in relation to your countries, whether that's economic partnership agreements, whether it's the GSP Plus scheme, whether it's the Everything But Arms scheme, or indeed the development commitments that the European Union has made to your countries, Britain is absolutely part of all of those commitments until the day we leave the European Union. And I would actually go further than that. Until we leave the European Union, we want to play a full role in policy making, I think perhaps in particular on external policy, areas of policy about how the European Union relates to the rest of the world. So, for example, we will be very closely involved in the formulation of a European position on what should follow on from the Cotonou Treaty when that is renewed in 2020. We will be absolutely at the heart of debates about trade policy, whether that is trying to get us over the line with concluding an EPA with East Africa, for example. I see Cuba here, or my Minister for Europe and the Americas will be in Brussels on Monday and will be signing the EU-Cuba agreement, which has just been reached. We will be absolutely at the heart of what the European Union does, even as we go through this transitional period. And there are a number of issues like trade facilitation. I was at Bali, and many of you were, I imagine, as well, and that historic agreement reached on trade facilitation. We're very conscious of how important that is to developing countries, that actually the real gainers from trade facilitation are countries in the ACP, and in particular, for example, landlocked countries in Africa. So we will remain passionately engaged on these issues. And as an overall posture, I think our ministers have been very, very clear since June that Britain is not turning away from the world. In fact, many of the people who voted for Brexit because they felt that actually we had turned too much towards Europe and not enough to the wider world. People's motivations for Brexit were complicated, but there is a very strong feeling and impetus in our government that actually Britain needs to re-engage with much of the world, including in some of the traditional relationships that we have perhaps neglected over the years. In a previous existence, I was the Foreign Office's Director for the Americas and worked very closely with William Hague as he led a push to reinvest in the Caribbean and in Latin America, a bit of the world that we had been drifting away from a bit too much. So we are not turning away from the world. We will maintain our commitment to spending 0.7% of GDP on overseas aid. In fact, that's a commitment which is enshrined in British law. And we are absolutely committed to remaining a free trading nation. And indeed, if you listen to many of the people who argued for Brexit, they would like us to be a more free trading nation with the rest of the world. I don't want to criticise European Union trade policy because I think overall it's been very successful. But there are definitely some areas where we would like to go further than the European Union has sometimes been able to do. So we're not turning away. We will maintain our commitments as they stand now. But I completely understand your questions about when we have left the European Union, what kind of trading relationships would we want to have with ACP countries? And I think this is a really important question. It's a question which our Trade Minister is focused on. It's also a question which our Development Minister is focused on. And there are strands of work going on in London at the moment to try and understand the issues and make sure that we come up with a sensible and ambitious policy. And it is, if I may say so, incredibly helpful for us to hear from you about where your preoccupations are, where your hopes are, where you think things might go further. And as a rule, ACP matters to us. This is a group of countries that matters to us, not just historically, as you say, Minister, but because we see many of you as the future. We see economies that have great potential to grow, great potential to cooperate with our economy and generate jobs and growth in future. Now, we cannot, for the moment, sit down and start negotiating with you what our future trading relationships might be. As long as we are still members of the European Union, we are bound by the disciplines of being part of the common commercial policy. And I don't know if the Commission are here today, but if I were to say to you now, yes, I'd like to sit down and start negotiating an FTA with you, they would very quickly remind me of the legal obligations that we have as the UK to remain part of the European Union disciplines and process. And that's right, and we respect that, and that's what we will do. However, what we are starting to do is to talk to as many partners as possible about how they see the future trading relationships. We have not yet reached any firm decisions on this, and when we do, you'll hear about them. But I think it's probably fair to say that our starting assumption will be to maintain as much continuity as possible. Some of you may have noticed that we made an announcement earlier in the week about how we will approach the question of our schedules and tariff rate quotas at the WTO. And what we basically said there was that we would begin a process of preparing to re-establish those schedules in our own right once we leave the European Union, on the basis that we would try and replicate what we do now. So nobody would lose any market access, nobody would be worse off in terms of their ability to trade with Britain as a result of us leaving the European Union. Now that principle is a principle we've established generally in terms of how we're approaching re-establishing ourselves in the WTO, but I think it gives you an indication of where our ministers are likely to come from in relation to bilateral trading relationships with all of you. Again, I would say the risk with the UK is not so much that we're going to offer less good market access than we've done in the past. It's that we come to you and start saying, right, let's go further. Let's do something more ambitious. You might find that, because trade negotiations always cut both ways, that may indeed be quite challenging. But I suspect that's where we are going to come from. And we will be, as ever, very, very interested in trying to construct trade relationships with you which support development, which are promoting inclusive, sustainable growth. So, I mean, you did raise another couple of other questions, Minister. Would we approach this bilaterally or regionally? I think it's probably too early to say, and I think a lot depends on you. And I think a lot depends on whether clusters of countries want to come to us and say, actually, we'd like to consider doing something with you on a regional basis. If that was the case, I'm sure we'd want to look at that. But to be honest, we haven't yet got as far as deciding whether we want to do things bilaterally or regionally. So just one last point I might just throw in. I mean, there is an option in terms of all FTAs, whether they're EPAs or other FTAs, of looking to see whether we cannot, at least to begin with, simply cut and paste agreements that already exist between the EU and third countries and replicate them. Now, I'm horribly simplifying, but you could look at a treaty that exists between the EU and a third country and take out the EU and put in the UK and see if that works. Now, you're all trade professionals, so you'll know it would be a lot more complicated than that. But it is certainly, as a point de départ, it's certainly a possibility that we look at simply trying to replicate the substance and the content of existing EU agreements, but on a UK to third country basis. But I think I'll stop there, and I'm very, very happy to take any questions that people might want to throw at me. And as I said at the beginning, it's actually for us a really, really helpful opportunity to listen and hear to what you have to say and where your concerns or hopes might be.